law of combination of different traits by the formation of hybrids.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving into a name that you probably recognize instantly. A name that's basically synonymous with the instruction manual for life itself. Gregor Mendel.
Right. But the story we're exploring today is so much more complex than, just peas and inheritance.
That's the core paradox, isn't it?
It really is. Mendel achieved this global scientific fame, but only after he was dead. During his actual lifetime, the man they called Brother Gregor was famous and often notorious for a completely different role.
Okay.
Our sources show these two distinct, almost incompatible identities. You have the world-changing scientist whose work was met with, total silence.
And then you have the other guy.
And then you have the political firebrand, the abbot who spent his final decade in this grueling, intense legal battle against the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
It's just astonishing. I mean, how did the man who unlocked the fundamental rules of genetics spend his last years battling bureaucracy, worrying about spies in his own monastery, and getting called a psycho by government officials?
That's what we're going to trace. Our mission today is to look at the forces that shaped this duality, to understand how this hyper-meticulous peasant-turned-scientist, Johann Mendel, gained knowledge so quickly, and how his monumental discovery was just overshadowed and nearly lost.
Right.
The biographical material we've pulled is fascinating because it contrasts his dirt-poor origins with the intellectual sanctuary he found, and then the administrative frustration that basically consumed him.
We're going to explore what happens when a truly radical scientific idea meets a profoundly conservative world.
Exactly.
Excellent. So let's start right at the beginning. We need to understand the absolute grind that formed his character, going back to this small, often overlooked corner of the empire.
Moravia and Silesia.
Exactly.
So replacing Mendel, born Johann in 1822, right in Heinges, or Heinzendorf. And this wasn't just any village, it was part of a region the Czech locals called Kravarsko.
Which literally means cowland.
Cowland, yeah. It sounds pastoral, but this was a tough, historically strategic area.
The geography and history here are so critical. I mean, this whole area was constantly being swept up in European campaigns.
Absolutely. The biographers contrast this picturesque setting with the lingering shadow of the Napoleonic Wars. Mendel's own father, Anton, actually survived those wars. He came back in 1817 to a life that, despite imperial decrees, it was anything but free.
And that's the key distinction. People think serfdom was abolished and that was it, but it's not that simple, is it?
Not at all. Serfdom was technically abolished by Emperor Joseph II. But the legal framework around land, the most crucial asset, it hadn't caught up. The land was emphatically not transferred to the peasants.
So they weren't technically owned anymore, but the economic shackles were still firmly in place. What specific burdens did the Mendel family face?
They faced the continued burden of what was called corvée labor. It's compulsory, unpaid work owed to the local gentry.
Unpaid work.
Exactly, and the sources are incredibly specific about the types. There was 1.5 days a week of Fußrobot, which is labor done on foot, and then another day and a half of Robot Mittenpferd, which required you to use your own horse or oxen.
And that distinction, with or without the animal, that's profound. It dictates your entire economic viability.
If you lost your horse, you were sunk. It meant the threat of constant, back-breaking, unpaid labor was just this guillotine hanging over the head of every bower, every hurtler, and especially the landless day laborers, the Häusler.
So Johann Mendel was born right into this struggle.
And that economic instability is what fueled his drive. But his intellectual promise, it just shone through immediately. His education at Piers College and then the gymnasium in Opava, he was consistently marked as Erster Vorzüglicher in der Klasse.
First among the distinguished.
Exactly.
It's this classic story of genius born into poverty, but the ascent came at an almost unbearable personal cost to his family. How do they even pay for this?
Well, the sources detail this act of just profound sacrifice. It was something Mendel carried with him his whole life. After his father had an accident, the family's finances were devastated.
Right.
So, to make sure Johann could continue his studies, his younger sister, Theresia, she gave up her entire dowry and her inheritance.
Wow. In 19th century Europe, that's a massive sacrifice. It basically tanks her own economic future.
It did. But Mendel, to his credit, later funded the medical education of 3 of her sons. He never forgot.
That detail really connects his personal integrity right back to those humble beginnings. But the desperation didn't end there, did it? Where did he go next?
He moved on to the Philosophical Institute in Olomouc, and this period was a real turning point. He tried desperately to find tutoring work to pay his way, but he failed. He just didn't have the social connections. He later wrote about it, described the experience as tormenting anxiety about daily bread. The fear of failing and having to go back to the farm was this intense psychological pressure.
So the priesthood, which he turned to in 1843, wasn't necessarily a purely spiritual calling.
No, it was a very carefully calculated practical escape hatch.
A career move.
It was a career move, rooted in pragmatism. There was a common saying back then, attributed to Emperor Karl V. 3 things: the church, the sea, the palace. Choose one and need is ended.
And for Mendel, the church was the only one on the table.
It offered immediate stability, an income, and crucially, social status. By entering the clergy, he was granted a status equivalent to knighthood. It was the only way to genuinely escape the economic gravity of cowland.
Precisely. So in 1843, Johann Mendel enters St. Thomas's Abbey in Old Brunno and chooses the name Gregor.
He exchanged the struggle for survival for the privilege of the cloth, but what he found at the Abbey wasn't asceticism, it was an intellectual goldmine.
And that takes us to the really unique environment that let the scientific part of his brain just flourish. When you imagine a 19th century monastery, you think of, silent contemplation, strict rules. St. Thomas's Abbey, where Mendel landed, was clearly a different beast altogether.
That's a perfect description. It was an intellectual powerhouse.
More like a think tank.
It was, yeah. And that was mainly because of the specific philosophy of the Augustinian order. They just didn't see secular and divine knowledge as mutually exclusive.
What was the philosophical distinction they made? That seems really important.
They followed St. Augustine's separation of knowledge into 2 types. There was scientia, which is rational knowledge of the objective, observable world.
Okay, so science.
Right. And then there was sapientia, which is knowledge of divine affairs, or wisdom. By putting scientific inquiry into the scientia bucket, they basically gave themselves theological permission to do deep secular research.
That is a monumental distinction. It's a green light. It let them run what was essentially a university inside the monastery walls.
And the leadership totally embraced this. The abbot who sponsored Mendel, Cyril Knapp, was incredibly enlightened. He was an Orientalist, a philologist, friends with all the big Czech national leaders.
And the faculty there was pretty impressive, too.
It reads like a who's who of local thinkers. You had the composer Pavel Szyszkowski and this fascinating character, Fadl Matthaus-Klossel. He was a philosopher and astronomer.
And the source material mentioned he was pretty controversial.
Extremely. Klossel got so into spreading radical Hegelian ideas within the monastery that the bishop eventually had him fired.
A monk got fired for being too philosophically cutting edge.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
It just tells you how loose and progressive the environment was.
So if the intellectual atmosphere was loose, what about the general lifestyle? Was it what you'd call a soft regime?
The sources definitely imply that. There's this wonderful anecdote about a botanist, Father Aurelius Taylor, who was there before Mendel. He perfectly illustrates the Abbey's tolerance.
Yeah, okay.
Taylor was famous for his Epicurean inclinations. He enjoyed the finer things in life, and he often indulged in die feuchte Fröhlichkeit.
Moist merriment. I love that phrase.
It's great, isn't it? So the story goes, one night, Taylor comes back to the Abbey late after a long evening of said merriment, and who does he find waiting for him?
The abbot.
Abbot Knapp. In the courtyard, dressed in full ceremonial robes, and Thaler, instead of apologizing, just stops short, looks up at the abbot, and dramatically exclaims, "Oh God, I am unworthy to enter thy house."
And what did he do then? Did he sneak in?
No. According to the accounts, he immediately turned around and marched back out, proclaiming he was going to wider trinken.
Drink further.
Drink further. The fact that this story survived with a kind of affection shows the whole climate. Discipline was secondary to intellectual talent.
So the genius of the Abbey was freedom. Freedom from economic worry and freedom from rigid intellectual dogma. And this environment was basically forced on Mendel because he was a complete failure as a priest.
That's the ultimate twist of fate. His first attempt at parish work, caring for souls, lasted barely a year. It failed in 1849.
And Abbot Knapp wrote a letter about it, didn't he?
A very specific letter. He identified the fatal flaw in Mendel's pastoral abilities.
Oh, what was that?
Knapp explained that Mendel was unfit for spiritual duties because, and I'm quoting here, the sight of suffering makes him so overwhelmed with irrepressible agitation that he himself becomes dangerously ill.
Wow. So he had no emotional distance. He couldn't develop that professional detachment you need to deal with death and poverty every day.
Exactly. He internalized it all. It's so revealing of his sensitive nature. This inability, or maybe it was a refusal to dull his empathy, meant he was effectively rejected by the spiritual world.
But that administrative failure opened the absolute best door for him. Knapp saw his talent, so he transferred Mendel to a different post.
Teaching and critically scientific study. His failure as a priest cleared the path to his greatness as a scientist. So after that brief and traumatic experience in the parish, Mendel becomes a substitute teacher, a supplent, at the Znojmo Gymnasium in 1849. And by all accounts, he was great at it.
The students liked him.
They respected him, yeah, talented instructor. But his economic reality, even with the abbey's protection, was still a problem. The lack of a proper diploma made his position precarious.
Right, he was getting paid less.
40% less than a certified teacher, and he could be replaced at any time. So this pressure forces him to try for the teaching certification exam in Vienna in 1850. And this is where we see the clash between his practical genius and the formal academic structure of the time.
And he failed. A devastating setback for someone who'd been first among the distinguished his whole life. Where did he stumble?
He did exceptionally poorly in natural history. The assessment from Professor Nur was just strongly negative. It was a failure of theory, not intelligence. His whole upbringing was hands-on problem solving, but the exam wanted rigid textbook knowledge.
And the sources have these amazing details about his attempts to explain things using practical methods.
Oh, absolutely. His physics paper especially. It shows this practical ingenuity he learned from his mentor, Father Franz. Like, when discussing atmospheric pressure, he describes this thought experiment.
Okay.
You inflate a bubble at the bottom of a mountain, take it to the top, and watch the pressure release show the change in air density.
That's a great vision.
And he also proposed these hands-on demonstrations. For a chemistry concept, like decomposing water, he didn't assume you had a fancy lab. He described stuffing a gun barrel with iron filings, heating it up, and forcing steam through it.
That's the mind of an inventor, an improviser.
A pragmatist.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing probably didn't impress a theoretical examiner looking for textbook definitions. Luckily, Abbot Knapp saw past the failure.
All right, Knapp recognized he didn't lack knowledge, he just lacked the formal framework.
So Knapp intervenes and sends him to Vienna University from 1851 to 1853 for full training, a critical investment.
And who did he study under there?
He was exposed to the absolute cutting edge. He studied physics under Christian Doppler.
It's Christian Doppler.
Yes, of the Doppler effect. And crucially for his future, he studied botany under Franz Kohler. This period gave him the formal tools, especially the mathematical rigor that he would later apply to biology.
And he got into the Vienna Zoological Botanical Society, so he was accepted academically even without the degree. And yet, after all that training, he tries the exam again in 1856 and fails a second time. Why didn't he just keep trying after that?
This is a huge turning point, and it speaks to the freedom the Abbey gave him. By 1856, the sources suggest he realized he didn't actually need the diploma for his security.
His status as a monk protected his income.
It protected his income and his position at the Brno Real School. The diploma for survival was now optional, so he could redirect all that energy from chasing paperwork to pure intellectual pursuit.
And he applies his new scientific training now with Doppler's mathematical approach to practical problems. Back to his roots.
Yes, starting with pests. In 1853, he's studying the Bodes margaritalis moth, a huge pest for cabbage and radish crops. Incredibly meticulous.
But the truly significant observation came in 1854 with the pea weevil, the Bruchus pisci. How did this tiny insect guide his destiny?
This is a beautiful detail. Mendel observed that the female pea weevil, to lay its egg inside the flower, had to physically open the keel, the closed part of the pea flower.
And the pea flower is normally closed off to self-pollinate, right? To ensure a pure line.
Exactly. So what did the weevil do by opening the keel?
It became an agent of cross-pollination.
An accidental agent. He saw these tiny pollen grains stuck to its legs. This small act of natural chaos, this thin thread, showed the fastidious Mendel that uncontrolled hybridization was happening all the time, even in a system designed for purity.
So if nature was introducing chaos, he realized that to understand the rules, he had to introduce absolute surgical control.
That's it. The weevil showed him the problem. His scientific training showed him the solution. Controlled hybridization in the isolated environment of the Abbey garden. That realization launched a decade of work.
So the decade between 1854 and 1864, in that small plot in the Abbey garden, That was his scientific peak. Let's start with his famous choice. The common garden pea, Pisum sativum. Why was this such a stroke of genius?
Well, it was almost the perfect organism for the question he was asking. First, peas are monoecious. They have both male and female parts. And second, they naturally self-pollinate. This let Mendel establish and maintain pure lines of traits, plants that bred true generation after generation before he even started his main work.
The meticulousness of that first step is just staggering. He wasn't just planting seeds.
No. The sources say he spent 2 full years, 1854 to 55, just on this validation phase. He tested over 30 varieties of peas to confirm their constancy. He had to be absolutely certain of his starting point.
And his central breakthrough was isolating variables. Others had tried and failed because they looked at composite traits, these blended characteristics.
Mendel abandoned that. He selected 7 pairs of clearly contrasting discrete traits, what he called anlagen, or hereditary factors. We're talking about simple binary switches.
Smooth seeds versus wrinkled.
Yeah.
Yellow versus green. Tall versus short.
Exactly.
This sounds so elementary to us now, but at the time, this was radical. What was the prevailing view he was fighting against?
He was fighting against the doctrine of blending inheritance. The scientific world pretty much believed that hereditary material mixed like fluids, like blending red and white paint to get pink.
And that was a huge problem for evolution, for Darwin.
A huge problem. It was called Jenkins' nightmare. If inheritance was blending, any favorable trait, any useful mutation would just get diluted with every generation until it disappeared completely.
It meant evolution couldn't work.
Right. Evolution requires variation to persist, not to be smoothed out.
And Mendel provided the answer. He showed that hereditary material wasn't fluid paint, it was discrete, like marbles. You can mix the marbles, but they never blend.
Precisely. And his true stroke of genius was applying math and statistics to this biological chaos. He didn't just describe what he saw, he quantified it. He used algebraic coding A for dominant, A for recessive, and he derived that famous numerical ratio.
Okay, let's slow down and walk through that ratio for everyone. How did he get to 3-to-1?
He started with 2 pure lines, say a pure line of yellow seeds, AA, and a pure line of green seeds.
Right.
When he crossed them, that first generation, the F1, was universally yellow, all A. That showed dominance. Then he let that F1 generation self-pollinate.
And that's where the segregation happens.
That's where the magic is. His counting was legendary. He worked with tens of thousands of individual plants. And in that second generation, the F2, he counted roughly 75% yellow seeds and 25% green seeds. That 3-to-1 ratio was mathematically consistent.
And the underlying genotype is actually 1 to 2-to-1. 1 pure dominant, 2 mixed, 1 pure recessive.
That's a deeper realization. He concluded that these factors, these anlagen, they separate cleanly during the formation of sex cells, a process he called segregation, and then they recombine randomly according to the laws of probability. For the first time, biology had an algebra.
And he knew he had found a universal law. The biographer's note he wrote that he had to assume that in basic moments there can be no difference in principle.
He thought he discovered the mathematical grammar of life. So he finalized his 47-page manuscript, Experiments on Plant Hybrids, and he presented it to the Brno Natural Science Society in 1865.
And the reaction to this earth-shattering insight.
Deafening silence. The sources confirm it. After the first half of his lecture, which was just dense with numbers and ratios, not a single question was asked. The second part was met with the same incomprehension.
How could the scientific community be so blind to a discovery of this magnitude?
It was a failure of language. The biologists of the 1860s were precise observers. They were taxonomists, morphologists. They looked at plants and described them. They weren't statisticians.
So he was speaking an alien language.
He introduced algebraic equations and probability to a field that spoke only in physical descriptions. They fundamentally didn't understand he had moved beyond describing the results to describing the mechanism of inheritance.
He was decades ahead of his time.
And he tried to overcome the silence. He printed 40 offprints of the paper and sent them to the most influential botanists across Europe, but the silence just persisted.
The world wasn't ready for Gregor Mendel, the scientist. But it was about to meet Gregor Mendel, the abbot and litigator. So the deep isolation of his scientific genius contrasts so violently with the very public, very confrontational role he takes on just 3 years later. In 1868, he's elected abbot.
And the sources say he was very politically astute. He actively campaigned, even predicted his own unanimous election.
He went from tending peas to managing millions of florins and hundreds of tenants.
And he immediately took an oath that became the engine of his administrative life, to protect the abbey's property and financial interests. And this thrust him right into a decade-long conflict with the central government.
The source of that conflict was the imperial religious fund tax. The government wanted an annual payment of over 7,000 florins. This sounds like standard taxation, so why did Mendel make it such a battle?
Because for Mendel, it was a fundamental matter of constitutional principle, not money. He saw the tax as illegal and discriminatory.
How so?
His main argument was that the state was treating the church differently from all other societies, which relied on voluntary funding. By taxing the abbey's existing wealth, the state was violating its rights and essentially seizing assets.
And this highlights that singular nature of his mind again. Whether it's peas or politics, he refused to tolerate inconsistency. The law was the law, just as the ratio must be the ratio.
Exactly. He refused any form of compromise. His allies, even some of his own monks, urged him to use loopholes like increasing his own salary to reduce the taxable base.
Now you wouldn't do it.
Absolutely refused. He saw it as legitimizing an unconstitutional law. He turned what could have been a quiet bureaucratic disagreement into this highly visible, decade-long war for the right.
And that rigidity had severe consequences. How did the government react to this monk who just would not back down?
They became exasperated, then punitive. They eventually arrested the abbey's income entirely, just froze its counts. In official correspondence, officials started calling Abbot Mendel a querulent, a quarrelsome person, and even a psycho.
A psycho, because he adhered too strictly to the law.
They even suggested he might require treatment in a special hospital for mental overstrain, hoping to force him to resign. He became totally alienated from his community. He was fighting alone.
And meanwhile, on the scientific front, he's still fighting for recognition. He sends his paper out, and the only famous person who responds is Carl Nageli.
Nageli was considered a star of the first magnitude in German botany, a towering figure. He responded in 1867, and while he called Mendel a dear colleague, he clearly treated him like a talented amateur, not a genius. He just didn't get the math.
So instead of exploring Mendel's math, Nageli issues a challenge.
A devastating one. Nageli suggested that Mendel repeat his work on a much more challenging plant, hawkweed, Hieracium. He was convinced that Mendel's universal laws, the 3-to-1 ratios, would break down, disproving them.
And Mendel, desperate for validation, he accepts. He spends years on hawkweed.
And he failed. He honestly reported back to Nageli that the hawkweed results did not follow the predicted ratios. And this scientific failure, paired with the administrative stress, eventually led him to abandon hybridization research entirely.
This is the ultimate scientific irony. Why did the hawkweed experiments fail? What was it that he didn't know?
He was caught in this cruel trap set by nature itself. He didn't know that Hieracium often reproduces asexually. It's a process called apomixis.
Okay, let's unpack that. If it reproduces asexually, how does that mask Mendelian inheritance?
Well, if a plant reproduces asexually, it bypasses the whole mechanism of meiosis, where the anlagen are supposed to separate cleanly into gametes.
Right.
So when Mendel cross-pollinated the hawkweed, the results he recorded weren't from true sexual recombination. The offspring were often just clones of the maternal plant.
So the pure lines never truly mixed and separated to produce that predictable ratio. It looked like his law was failing, when really the plant wasn't even playing by the rules he'd discovered.
It confirmed Nageli's prejudice, and it crushed Mendel's spirit. The challenge he couldn't resolve, combined with the war for the right, effectively ended his genetics research.
But even though he stopped hybridization, he never abandoned his quest for quantitative order. What were his final interests?
He continued his work in meteorology, building on his training with Doppler. He famously documented a severe tornado that hit Brno in 1870. And he pursued apiculture, trying to hybridize different bee races.
Did the bee experiments work?
Unfortunately, no. Bee genetics are far more complex, so those results also failed to show the simple Mendelian ratios.
And then there's the truly cryptic project of his later years, the surname project.
This project just perfectly encapsulates his obsessive search for discrete factors. Around 1878, he asked his relatives to start systematically collecting all surnames ending in Man, Bauer, and Hauer.
That seems like such a random, almost pointless task for an abbot.
To us, yeah. But linguists who analyze this think it was another attempt to apply his mathematical logic to chaotic human phenomenon. He saw Man, Bauer, and Hauer as discrete factors, like linguistic and login.
So he was trying to find numerical laws in human naming conventions, just like he found them in seed color.
He was trying to find the genetic rules of human culture, always seeking that algebraic clarity, whether in nature, law, or language. By the early 1880s, that decade of frustration had taken its toll. Mendel's health deteriorated rapidly. He had nephritis, heart failure. He died an isolated, paranoid man.
The isolation sounds intense. He was still fighting the government over the tax, and he was estranged from his own monks. The sources say he bought 2 huge St. Bernard dogs, not just as pets, but for protection.
Protection from both secular authorities and his own community.
And he was under surveillance.
He was. The bishop appointed a spy, a Father Kratky, to monitor his activities and health. It shows just how much tension and mistrust surrounded him in his final years.
And yet, even as his body was failing, his scientific mind stayed razor sharp. What were his final acts?
His dedication to truth never wavered. He demanded clinical clarity from his doctors. Nephritis, heart weakness, dropsy. He wanted the precise terms. And he insisted on checking his meteorological instruments every day.
Wow.
And on a personal level, just before he died on January 6, 1884, he told his nephews he wouldn't have supported them financially if they had chosen the clergy. A final rejection of that compromised career path that had secured his own success.
His very last request was scientific.
Yes. He requested an autopsy to confirm the exact cause of death. He needed the physical truth, even of his own demise.
The irony of his death is just overwhelming. And the tragedy followed immediately after.
Mendel's successor, Abbot Anselm Rambusek, even though he was a friend, he ordered the bulk of Mendel's papers. All the work notes, the calculations, the diaries burned. He called them useless papers.
It's horrifying to think about what was lost in that fire.
Yeah.
The inner workings of genetic algebra, all just gone.
The seminal 47-page manuscript, Experiments on Plant Hybrids, it only survived through sheer negligence. It was overlooked, tucked away, and just never got incinerated. It sat forgotten for 16 years.
And the funeral was massive.
Yeah.
The irony of that moment is heartbreaking.
Political, financial, and ecclesiastical dignitaries all attended to mourn the powerful abbot, the litigator, the financier.
Scientific leader.
Right. The obituary celebrated him as a great benefactor, a patron of natural science, but they completely failed to grasp the magnitude of his real work. The local paper called his work epical, but had no idea what that epoch actually was.
No one, not the bishop, not the government officials, and certainly not Nageli, understood that the man who held the key to inheritance had just been buried.
But Mendel himself died convinced of his own future recognition. Shortly before his death, he famously said, "I am convinced that not much time will pass and the whole world will recognize the results of these labors."
And he was only off by 16 years, which in the timeline of scientific recognition is remarkably accurate.
Yes, the rediscovery happened in 1900, independently, almost simultaneously, in 3 European labs. Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Carl Correns in Germany, and Erich Schermack in Austria. All 3 confirmed the precise 3-to-1 ratio.
They found the law all over again.
And the sources confirmed the humility of that moment. Hugo de Vries, when writing up his findings, was horrified to realize he'd been scooped 4 decades earlier by some obscure monk.
Wow.
They immediately added a footnote citing Mendel's 1865 paper, acknowledging he only read it after his own research. And that footnote, citing the genius from Brno, finally ushered in the age of genetics and confirmed Mendel's belief in his own eternal fame. #outro info.
The life of Gregor Mendel is just. It's a powerful testament to concentrated genius. A man whose rigorous intellectual discipline, forged in the poverty of the cowland, led him to demand mathematical clarity in every single domain he touched.
Biology, constitutional law, even the structure of language.
His 2 greatest battles, the one against Nogeli over the hawkweed and the one against the state over the tax, they both ended in his own personal defeat.
And yet, the tax fight secured his ethical legacy as a defender of principle. And the scientific work, though it was frustrating for him, secured his eternal fame.
So for you, the learner, the key takeaways from this deep dive are clear. First, true breakthroughs often require the courage to impose a new foreign language. Mendel brought math and probability to a descriptive science.
And second, isolation and intense focus are often prerequisites for discovery. He became this twice hermit, cutting himself off from spiritual distractions and later from political compromise, just to concentrate completely on his quantitative search for truth.
But let's close on that final provocative thought, that cryptic surname project.
Right.
Mendel's entire life was defined by this relentless pursuit of discrete factors in login and numerical ratios. If he was applying this same logic to something as chaotic as human surnames, the distribution of Man, Bauer, and Hauer, what fundamental underlying laws did he believe govern the world that we have still failed to measure? What other algebraic codes were lurking among the notes and diaries that were ultimately burned as useless papers?
Something to mull over.
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.
Join us and keep your curiosity well fed. Who knows? The next video might be exactly what you didn't know you needed.